Good evening. My name is Peter Kareiva. I'm the CEO and president of the Aquarium, and this is the third of a new series we're doing. It's a variation on the lecture series, but the notion is to have people talk about interesting, sometimes controversial, difficult topics and have conversations afterwards, because I just think there's not enough conversation where people have different ideas. We just balkanize in our different camps, and that's the kind of vibe we're trying to create here and try to get really thought leaders for the whole world. So tonight, it's Emma Marris. I've known her for quite a while. She grew up in Seattle, and so I'm wearing my Seattle attire, which is all black in honor of Emma. And I'm not going to go through all the normal stuff other than say she is absolutely my favorite science writer. Most science books I do not like because they just believe what scientists tell them, which you should never do. Emma, actually teaches science to scientists because she asks probing questions. And I hope you'll see that you may not agree with her, but you will see that she thinks deeply and creatively, but also playfully about issues, and is a wonderful writer. So afterwards, we'll have a reception with drinks outdoors and a book signing. You can buy a book and talk to your people you know and people you don't know about her topic. What else? I got to remember everything that Dina told me that I've already forgot. Oh, I really want to thank Dave Summers. I can't see him now in the dark, but of the Long Beach Post, because it put a lot of creative effort into thinking about how we could market and get crowds to this new series. And Dave, you did a terrific job, and we're really, really grateful for what the Long Beach Post did. We have more coming up. And so the next one is going to be on robotics. It's always first Wednesdays. We'll have one on ocean sewage, and we're really trying to touch a wide range of topics that impact things that we at the aquarium care about, and I think the community cares about. I don't think I need to say anything else now, other than there'll be a short period of time for questions. You can direct at Emma, and if you're shy, you don't have to ask questions afterwards when we go outdoors. And we're standing around, and you have a glass of water or wine or beer, and then maybe you'll build up the courage to ask questions. So with that, I turn it over to Emma. Thank you for coming. She flew all the way down here.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is as Peter said, there's maybe going to be some challenging ideas in this talk, and I'm really looking forward to the question and answer section. So I'm going to try to motor right through this material so we can get there. I'm going to start with this tweet, or maybe it was a Facebook post by this guy named Randy, and it says, 1,000 Timbits ready for bear feeding. And if you don't know what a Timbit is, then you're not from Canada, because it is a Tim Hortons name for donut holes. So this guy went out and bought 1,000 donut holes and then just drove around Banff and areas around there feeding the bears. And I start with this because I feel like we can all start on the same page, which is don't do this. This is not a good way to interact with wild animals. So great, we're all on the same page now, and we'll see if we stay on the same page. I think a lot of us have a pretty strong intuition that the best thing to do in regards to wild animals is to leave them be. There's a philosopher named Claire Palmer who's at Texas A&M, and she calls this the laissez-faire intuition. Leave animals be. Don't mess with them, don't hurt them, don't harm them, but also there's no duty to assist them. So I put up here a picture of a horse that's too skinny. This was a news article kind of talking about how this horse's owner was a bad person because they didn't feed their horse. And I think we can all agree that that's true. The horse was under the care of this person. But next to it, we have a very skinny deer. And most of us feel that there's really no ethical obligation for us to intervene in this case. Yes, the deer maybe is pretty skinny, you can see its ribs, but that's just nature taking its course. So we don't have any ethical obligation to go feed that deer. So in my first book, Rambunctious Garden, which came out 10 years ago now, I took a pretty hard look at the notion of nature and wilderness that I grew up with. As Peter mentioned, I grew up in Seattle, so it's a very outdoorsy culture. I did a lot of camping and hiking. I was very much raised to sort of worship old-growth forests. And I had a very kind of purist and a very almost snobby definition of nature. It had to be pretty untouched by humans. But the more I learned about the science of conservation biology and ecology, the more I began to realize that there really isn't any place left that's completely untouched by humanity. Massive land use changes in our kind of more recent hundreds of years have transformed a huge swath of the Earth's surface. But even before the historical period, there were lots of prehistoric land management on all continents, including North America, well before colonization, that fundamentally changed the ecosystems here. And of course, now there's climate change, which means that every part of the planet, even places that have never even seen a human, are being affected by human actions. So what I concluded in Rambunctious Garden is essentially that wildness, wilderness, natural, that these values that I grew up with and that most of us grew up with were sometimes not working for conservation. That you could have a conservation that's focused around protecting biodiversity, avoiding extinctions, trying to make sure that ecosystems stay resilient in the face of changes, and you could do all of that without having naturalness or wilderness as your central value. So that's what my first book was really about. And honestly, as the cover implies, a lot of it had to do with plant ecology, because when you look at how ecosystems are structured, the plant interactions sort of set the stage so I talked a little bit less about animals in that book. But 10 years later, or actually less than 10 years later, back in 2013, I moved to Oregon. I had been in the Midwest for a while. And I started thinking about wildness as it applied to animals. At that time in 2013, there were a lot of news stories in Oregon about wolf management. Back then, we only had maybe 60 or 70 wolves in the state. There were a lot of ongoing, very political, very heated discussions about how we should be managing them. And I lived not far away from a particular wolf that was kind of famous. He was called OR7, also known as Journey, which is a name that he was given by the Oregon Wild Conservation Organization. And he lived really nearby, and I knew he lived really near my new house in Klamath Falls because he had a GPS collar on, so the scientists knew where he was at all times. And I started to wonder about how wild this animal really was. Every time his collar went dead, they would re-trap him and put a new collar on him. And if he started to eat livestock, then they would potentially go out and haze him away. Or if he ate too many steers or calves, he could be shot. And it seemed to me that if this wolf was only living in the wild by our sort of indulgence, the indulgence of its human masters, who could at any time, if they wanted, remove him from the ecosystem by tracking him down with GPS and shooting him, was that really a wild animal? Or was that sort of a free-range pet with lots of tags and its DNA on file? So I started to really question this notion that wild animals were really wild. If I had written a whole book saying that wilderness was, places that we thought of as wilderness were actually quite human managed, didn't the same thing also apply to many wild animals? They were being very managed by humanity and very influenced by humanity. Even animals that have never seen a human are living in these ecosystems that we have changed. They're breathing this atmosphere that we have enriched with more carbon dioxide because of climate change. In some ways, they're all living in this human world. And does that mean that we now have different duties towards them? That maybe this laissez-faire intuition is no longer just the one-size-fits-all ethical rule? If they're all living in our world, do we have more obligations? And so that's what really brought me to the project of Wild Souls. And halfway through writing it, as I was actually sanding my deck, and all of a sudden, as one does, I had this kind of epiphany that the wildness that really mattered in the case of wild animals maybe wasn't whether or not they had DNA that was mixed up with a domestic animal, whether they were pure in that sense, or whether they were of a certain species. Their wildness that was valuable was their own individual autonomy, their ability to decide what to do, to make choices in their own lives. that was maybe more valuable than this sort of untouched by humans concept, that the animal was somehow not influenced by humans in any way. So that's one of the premises of Wild Souls, that the wildness that is valuable is the individual autonomy of animals. But it didn't answer all of my questions. There are a lot of questions about how to conceptualize what to do about wild animals. And one of the problems is that some of the values out there in the non-human world are not compatible with each other. So let's think about where is the value out there in what we like to call nature. I think all of us would agree that nature is valuable. We want to protect it and preserve it. But why? What is it that's valuable about it? So I kind of tried to make a list, and one thing that I think is valuable about the non-human world is that the individual animals that live in it are valuable in the same way that people are valuable, right? So maybe not exactly the same as people, but in a similar way. So this is where I get philosophical, right? So if you're reading an ethics textbook, you will tend to find that almost all ethical theories start with the premise that a sentient human being is just valuable in and of itself. You can't go around murdering people because human lives are valuable. And I think many ethicists have now extended this to at least sort of animals that are close to us on the taxonomic tree. So they seem to be valuable as well because they have selves, they have memories, they have intentions, they can feel pain, they have emotions. So that seems valuable. But then so do species. Species also seem valuable. When you talk to conservationists about biodiversity, that seems valuable. Just the fact that there's lots of different kinds of life in the world seems like something that we want to protect and preserve. Now, it can be tricky because species, although you can look in a textbook and it seems as if they're all in their nice, neat boxes, in reality, defining the lines between very closely related organisms is not always so easy. And ultimately, it's an arbitrary decision on the part of science, whether two things are two subspecies or two species or two distinct populations within a species. There's a lot of judgment calls there. Ecosystems, too, seem valuable to us. If we could preserve just a tiny, the sort of bare minimum size population of every species on Earth, but they were all separated from each other, I don't think that we would feel like we'd done our job as protectors of nature. We want to see all of these species interacting together in a way where they're in a food web together, or they're helping each other, or they're predating on each other. That it's that flow of energy and information, that network that's valuable. And then many people also find a lot of value in the nativeness or naturalness. Now, these last 2 points go back to some of the discussions I had in my first book. I was critical of both of these concepts, but I do think it's fair to say that many people ascribe a higher value to a native species than a non-native species. And many people believe that things are more valuable if they are natural. So what I do in my book is I try to figure out which of the things in this list are really valuable, using the tools and approaches that philosophers use. And one of the things to do is to look at case studies where you have to trade off between these different values. And that helps you think through which ones are really where the value lies. So what I'm going to talk about today is just one of those trade-off pairings, which is species versus individuals. Imagine that you have 500 tigers left in the world. When one of those 500 tigers dies, it is sad because that tiger died, but it's also sad because now the species of tiger is one individual closer to extinction. But in some cases, so you would think that people who love animals and people who want to save species would always be on the same team. We're trying to keep them alive. The more the better. But interestingly, there are a lot of cases where species and individuals are actually pitted against one another. And there's different philosophical approaches for species than there are for individuals. So when you talk about individuals, one of the sort of classic philosophers to talk about is Peter Singer, who's a utilitarian, which basically just means that he thinks that the consequences of our action are what we should look at to determine whether it's a right action or a wrong action. It's almost like a math problem. if I do this thing, will it make the sum total of sentient creatures in the world more happy or less happy? Will it increase the total happiness or decrease the total happiness? But what's interesting is that while his critique that came out in the 1970s and really focused on farm animals and laboratory animals, he had very little to say about wild animals. In the book, he just says we should leave them alone. He kind of falls back on the laissez-faire intuition. Another really common approach to looking at individual animal ethics is a rights approach, which is different than this sort of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. This rights approach is actually more like something that Immanuel Kant would have come up with if you took philosophy in college, except Kant didn't think animals counted. He only thought people had souls. But I guess you could say Tom Reagan is kind of like an animal Kantian. He thinks that because they are selves, because they are subjects of a life, you just have to respect them. You can't use them as a tool for another means. So for example, he says that it doesn't really matter whether you're a rare animal or a common animal, you have the same right to exist and to be happy. So he probably wouldn't like the fact that we pay more attention to trying to preserve rare animals than we do towards keeping common animals happy. But, he wrote, the citation is for 2004, that's the reprint. The original book was written in the 80s. And like Peter Singer, he mostly believed that we could discharge our duties to wild animals by leaving them the heck alone. Okay, so now let's contrast those approaches with conservation values. Michael Toulé, who sadly died just recently, was extremely kind in that he wrote a paper back in the 80s that just laid out what are the central value propositions of conservation biology. It's very useful. I really wish that all scientific fields would have one of these. But he laid them out. Diversity of organisms is good, extinction is bad. And so it's a total focus on populations, no focus on the individuals. He even says right in the paper that although disease and suffering in animals are unpleasant and perhaps regrettable, biologists recognize that conservation is engaged in the protection of the integrity and continuity of natural processes, not the welfare of individuals. So he basically doesn't care as much what happens to individual animals. And now I just want to make it clear that there's lots of other approaches too. In fact, one that I'm very fond of is the work of Val Plumwood, an Australian philosopher, who talks about how humans can think about interspecies ethics without thinking of ourselves as a totally different category than all the other animals, which I think is correct. We are not a totally different category than all the other animals. We just are a really causally efficacious in the world and sometimes slightly overconfident animal. So in her position, for example, she believes that it's okay to hunt for food as long as we appreciate the fact that we too might be food someday for some other animal. So she wants to kind of situate us back in the food web. So in the book, I go over a number of case studies where individuals and species are actually kind of opposed to one another ethically. We'll talk about some of these just briefly. Captive breeding, we're asking individuals of a rare species to give up their freedom and to perhaps undergo some not super pleasant, artificial insemination procedures in order for their kind to continue to exist. The second case study is where we are killing introduced predators of species A in order to save members of species B, which they are eating. This sounds like it might be kind of a rare situation, but actually it's extremely common in conservation because so many highly endangered animals are on islands. And on islands, one of the biggest threats to endangered species is often introduced predators. So here in continental North America, we don't see this dynamic as often, but if you live in Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, this is the number one conservation activity is usually to poison things. The third point is somewhat related to the third case study, somewhat related, which is killing or sterilizing, hybridizing individuals to keep those species distinctions separate and clear and keep those genetic lines pure. And the fourth one is the one that I think will be most interesting for us here to discuss today, which is breeding or capturing animals for display in zoos and aquariums as ambassadors of their species to convince humans to care for their kind. So let's go through some of the other ones relatively quickly so we have a little more time for the last point. The first one I want to talk about is captive breeding. In the book, I used the condor case. So all California condors that existed in the late 80s were taken into captivity. I think they got down to 26 individuals, because conservationists simply believed that if they didn't do so, we would lose the entire species. And I think that they were almost certainly correct. They didn't quite understand it right at the time, but what was killing them was mostly lead poisoning. They were eating the leftover gut piles that hunters left behind that were riddled with lead shot, and they were just dropping dead of lead poisoning. But back in the 80s, that wasn't totally understood. What was just understood is that they were declining alarmingly. And what I think some people have forgotten, or at least I didn't know, was that at the time, there were some conservationists who thought that they should just be they should be allowed to essentially die with dignity, that capturing them into a captive breeding program was worse, a fate worse than death, that the loss of their autonomy, that them being all cooped up in cages was unacceptable. So this image is actually of a protest at the Los Angeles Zoo in the mid-'80s of people who said, don't take the condors into captivity. Ultimately, I think that the decision to take them into captivity was the right one from both the individual and the species perspective. The species probably would have gone extinct if it hadn't been for the breeding program. And crucially, the individual birds that were taken into protection, into these big cages, they probably too would have died by lead poisoning. And so their individual lives were probably saved by being taken into captivity. So it's pretty easy to make an argument in this case that the right thing was done. I think it can be a little more complicated when you're looking at a captive breeding program that's going to breed for several generations before any releases occur. Because then you're asking several generations of animals to live their lives in captivity so that their great-great-grandchildren can go back out and repopulate the world. And of course, in all of these cases, we can't really ask the animals if they are going to consent to this. We just have to make the decision for them. One thing that I particularly like about the condor case is because they're such long-lived birds, that some of the birds that were taken into captivity in the 1980s were actually let out again in releases that took place in the 90s and were able to lead out the last years of their lives flying free again, which has a certain niceness to it. Now we'll talk about killing to save species. So this image is of albatrosses and an albatross chick. And these are house mice. So this is a particular case where house mice that were introduced to the island, the Gough Island, have been eating these albatross chicks alive, essentially. And of course, the conservation community is really concerned about this. What makes it a particularly tidy case study is that on Gough Island is almost the entire breeding population of the Tristan albatross. So you have a case where if nothing is done, the population modeling papers suggest that we'll lose the species. We really do have to decide between poisoning the mice and letting the species go extinct. Now, if you were Tom Reagan and you said that rare animals and common animals are equally valuable, then the fact that there are probably more mice on the island than there are albatross chicks might lead you to believe that you should just let nature take its course and do nothing and allow the mice to eat the albatross chicks. But I think most of us would argue that in this case, it's acceptable to poison the mice and kill them in order to save the albatrosses. One thing that makes it a little harder to swallow is that the poison that's most efficacious for removing rodents is not a particularly nice way to die. Because rodents are pretty smart, if you give them a poison that makes them feel sick right away, they will stop eating it, and others will notice that they're stopping eating it, and they'll all become shy of the poison. So what really is the best thing to do is to give them a slow-acting poison. Slow-acting poisons are not a pleasant way to die, unfortunately. I won't go into the gory details, but when it takes you a week to die, it's probably not a good thing. This is the Kakapo, a flightless parrot native to New Zealand. It is adorable, charming, highly endangered, and this is what happens to its eggs when there are rats around. So this is just one of the many, many really charismatic bird species in New Zealand that are threatened by introduced predators. The predators that make the most problems are rats and stoats, or they're weasels, essentially, like the least weasel. And Also, brush-tailed possums, although I'm a little bit skeptical, honestly, about some of the data showing that brush-tailed possums are a major threat. But that's a side note. And, of course, feral cats. So they have started an initiative to try to get rid of all of the introduced predators, with the exception of feral cats, because that's politically untenable to kill that many cats. And it's called Predator Free 2050. The idea is they want to rid the entire country of these introduced predators by 2050. And it sounds really ambitious, but frankly, after seeing their response to COVID, I think they might actually be able to pull it off. And one way that they're proposing to do this is that they're not just leaving it to the professionals. They're making this eradication of the non-natives sort of a cultural movement. They're bringing school groups and tribes and community groups into the fold. And it's very easy to send away for your own rat trap and to join the kind of the fight to keep New Zealand pure. In fact, the tourism slogan of New Zealand is 100% pure. And that's what they're going for. So they're trying to do this massive kill-off, but it's led to a slightly strange culture. New Zealanders, I don't know if any of you have been there, but they're extremely kind, sweet, cozy people. But then they get this kind of gruesome pleasure in killing these introduced animals. This was a school fundraiser where the family that brought in the most dead possums won, and where the school children were actually encouraged to dress up the dead possums in costumes. And I don't know, what struck me about this is that these possums don't know they're in the wrong place. They don't have any malintent. They're not trying to cause problems. They were born in these places, and they're just making a living, trying to eat and raise babies and live their lives. And the idea that it's okay, not only okay to kill them, but it doesn't matter how brutally you do it, seems a little strange to me. I went to a wildlife refuge in Wellington where you can actually buy a throw pillow to celebrate Predator Free 2050. And here it has the rat, the stoat, and the possum with the big X's through it, and the kiwi bird, their national symbol, with a big happy check. So conservation killing has actually kind of been ramping up, I would say, in the last 10 years. The kind of scale of poisoning campaigns and shooting campaigns has increased. Some major campaigns, like shooting all the goats in the Galapagos, have surprised people with how much can be done. And in response, there's been this counter movement that calls itself compassionate conservation. This picture is of a woman named Arian Wallach, who I interviewed for the book, who argues that we just don't have the right, I think she takes more of a rights type of position like Tom Regan does, that we just don't have the right to decide who lives and who dies. That these are all sentient beings out there, they're all trying to make their way in the world, and it's chauvinistic of us to try to decide who the winners and losers should be. In some cases, she comes up with, her and her compatriots in this movement come up with sort of win-win solutions where you can come up with other ways to preserve populations without killing. The sort of most famous case is a colony of little penguins, which is their formal name in Australia, that was being eaten by foxes, and instead of poisoning all the foxes, this conservation group decided to hire and train livestock guarding dogs to guard the penguins from the foxes. And that's what they've done for successfully now for almost a decade, is they have these big, floppy, lovable dogs guarding the penguins. So, I mean, that's obviously a really compelling story. In fact, they even made a family movie about it called Audubon. But in some cases, you're not going to have these win-wins. I don't think you could do something similar with the Tristan albatrosses and the mice, for example. In that case, you might really have to decide between killing the mice and letting the albatrosses go extinct. And just so we can know that, this is mostly an island dynamic, but there are some places where this happens closer to home on the continent. And this is where we get into the sort of reluctance to see different species hybridize. That's often, so this is I'm sure we've all know the spotted owl from the role that it played as an endangered species that helped reshape the entire timber industry in the Pacific Northwest in the 1990s. And it became the target of ire for those who felt that they had lost an industry that was important to them. Well, now it's being threatened again, but this time not by logging, but by its cousin, the barred owl, which was an East Coast species, pretty closely related, that for reasons that are not completely understood, has been moving west. Some people say that it was the telephone poles. Some people say it's reforestation of the Great Plains areas. Some people say it might be climate change, but for whatever reason, it's moving west, basically on its own steam, and it's now hanging out in spotted owl territory. Now, it is just a more flexible, tougher bird than its cousin, the spotted owl. It can live in these kind of old growth habitats that the spotted owl likes, but it kicks out the spotted owl and takes its nesting cavities. It can also live in much more disturbed second growth or fragmentary habitat. And it sometimes mates with spotted owls and creates hybrid offspring called sparred owls. So the question is, what do you do about this? Humans didn't necessarily move it. It came on its own, seems sort of natural, maybe, but of course the whole system is unnatural because we've changed it all and we put in all those roads and those forests and those telephone poles. So for now, the Fish and Wildlife Service is piloting a project of simply going in and shooting the barred owls. And that's what we're doing now. But I think that even the Fish and Wildlife Service is uneasy with this solution. And there are some people who want to know if maybe these sparred owls will be more successful in the current mixed up habitat that exists in the Pacific Northwest. Maybe they are, in fact, the best chance for the spotted owl genes to persist into the future. Maybe if we try to keep the spotted owl pure, we will eventually lose all of those genes. And then the last case along these lines that I wanted to mention is the case of wolves. This wolf is at a place called Wolf Haven, which is a sanctuary in Washington State. And the reason it's there is because it and its sister mated with a dog. And wildlife managers in Washington State didn't know what to do with that. They were very confused whether the offspring would be an endangered species or a pest. So they sterilized the sister and then took this wolf into captivity. So she's now living at Wolf Haven because she didn't do it right. She chose the wrong kind of mate. Her choice was unacceptable to wildlife managers. And I understand completely. If I was working for, Washington Department of Fish and Game, I think I would have a headache too, trying to think about the bureaucratic nightmare of having your endangered species give birth to a litter of feral dogs, essentially. But it was a sad ending, and it made me think of that. In some ways, it shows that we value the sort of genetic purity of these animals more than their actual functional wildness in terms of them being able to make their own choices. So that choice piece is going to bring us to zoos and aquaria. So I focus a lot in my book on elephants. Elephants are really big, really social. In the wild, they move a lot. They cover a lot of ground. And so I think that many people feel like they're a poor fit for a captive setting. This particular elephant in this picture is Chai, who is an elephant at the Woodland Park Zoo for many years. The Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle ended its elephant program, largely in part due to public sentiment changes. The elephants just didn't have enough room at the zoo. They had some deaths of adult and juvenile elephants, and the tide just turned against it. So their elephants went to Oklahoma, including Chai, and she died there under sort of dubious circumstances. She obviously wasn't doing well. She'd lost a lot of weight after her transfer, and it wasn't a happy story. And in general, elephants in captivity live a lot. They die a lot younger than elephants in the wild. One thing that's tricky with having any animal in captivity is we can't go over and chat with them about whether or not they're happy and how they're doing and if they'd prefer to see anything different. We have to kind of guess at all of that stuff. But I think that sometimes the animals do tell us that they're not happy with captivity by doing things like trying to escape repeatedly or dying young of causes that probably things that wouldn't happen to them in the wild, and often through these kind of repetitive behaviors that biologists call stereotypies. So in terrestrial zoos, you often see big cats that pace back and forth. Elephants tend to rock back and forth like this, kind of a rocking behavior. Giraffes stick out their tongues. There's a lot of hair pulling among monkeys and apes. So there's a lot of range of sort of stereotyped behaviors that tend to be an indication that the animal isn't happy. So part of my book was recently published in the New York Times, and this is the headline they gave it. The headline that I originally suggested was, "Zoos must transform, change some of the ways that they operate, change whether or not they breed animals. I think this headline is accurate in the way that what I'm saying here is that zoos as they are currently being run are not worth the moral cost. Obviously, this was a controversial opinion, and after this came out, I was like, Peter, are you sure you still want me to come? But he said, yes, let's have this conversation. So here's my basic argument in this chapter. I think the flourishing of sentient creatures is valuable. And I use the word flourishing here. It's kind of Aristotle used a word that's often translated as flourishing when he did his ethics. So it's sort of a philosophy jargon term, but it basically means living a good life, having a good life. And I think that for some animals, that might include autonomy. So depending on what your animal's brain is like, they may or may not get upset if they can't make their own choices about where to go, what to eat, who to mate with, those kinds of things. Some animals clearly don't do well when they are in situations where they can't do those things, can't make those choices. Other animals maybe don't mind. So some animals like orcas and elephants, big cats, great apes, maybe octopi, do seem to suffer in captivity, and they do try to escape. Actually, the literature on animal escapes is really fascinating. I spent a long time reading these escape stories. What was really interesting to me is, the taxa, the kinds of animals that tended to try to escape the most were primates, which is interesting to me because they're the closest to us evolutionarily. And one thing I found really interesting is that there was so often it was a repeat behavior. They would escape, they'd get caught, they'd get put back, and they'd escape again, and it would be this chronic thing. It seems hard to imagine that those animals didn't want out. Now, in an aquarium setting, do we see the same kind of signs that animals aren't happy? I don't think the science is as developed, but I did find some information about this issue that sand tiger sharks sometimes have, because they will get into a repetitive swimming behavior where they always are swimming in the same direction over and over and over again. This is kind of very similar to like when you see cats at the zoo doing a pacing. And if they're always going the same direction, and if the tank is circular, then they're always bending their spine in the same direction, and they can actually get these kind of physical problems because of that. So I think that there are hints that some aquarium animals maybe aren't happy in captivity, or at least not in every type of captivity. Maybe there is a tank that's big enough and complex enough that they would be just totally happy as can be and would have no desire to get out. But I think that what is true is that in a lot of zoos, and probably also in aquaria, the very same animals that are the biggest draws for the paying customers are often the ones that don't do as well in captivity. That's the irony. The number one draw for zoos is elephants, and they're the ones that do the absolute worst. All big draws at terrestrial zoos are also the gorillas and the big cats, again, animals that don't do as well. I suspect that there's probably a similar pattern in aquaria. Obviously, we're living through the end of the whale era in aquaria, but before, 20 years ago, I'm sure that was the biggest draw for aquariums across the country and the world. So in order to justify the continued display of animals that maybe are not happy or are hard to keep happy in the captivity, you gotta have some sort of win. There's gotta be some value that they're providing, and that's where this sort of ambassador argument comes in. Are these animals fulfilling a function for their species that's important enough that it's worth some level of suffering? I don't think that the data is there to show that zoos and aquaria really change visitors' behavior in terms of conservation intent or engagement. I looked at the studies, I called the AZA, I said, give me your best stuff. They sent me some papers, they suggested some researchers to talk to. I read everything they sent to me, I interviewed every researcher they suggested, and the data just still wasn't very compelling. Now, that doesn't mean that individual people haven't had their lives changed by experiences at zoos and aquaria. I think we all know somebody who had a moment at a zoo, had a moment at an aquarium that changed the whole course of their lives. I've met people who've told me these stories. But if you look at the data on the mass of visitors who come through, does going to the aquarium change your behavior in terms of voting, in terms of supporting conservation with donations, in terms of any of those things? The data does not support that there's any major change. And I suppose it's not that surprising because we've had zoos and aquariums now for, several generations, and we have still the biodiversity crisis all around us. I think the other argument is maybe it's hard to show that taking your kids to the aquarium for the day is going to change your kids' view on conservation. Maybe it's hard to connect those dots. But there's also a new focus on using zoos and aquariums as a way to create empathy for non-human animals among the visitors. And I think that that's really interesting. But I think that in some weird ways, zoos and aquariums might actually be doing too good a job at creating empathy for animals, such that now people are so empathetic towards the animals that they don't like to see them in zoos and aquariums anymore. So this is an example that just happened just last month. So the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium, which is up in Tacoma, captured this giant Pacific octopus for their display. And they did the classic move that aquariums and zoos have loved to do, which is let's have a naming contest. So this was written up in the Seattle Times. And what was really interesting to me is that if you went to the comments after this, there were no name suggestions. There was not like, let's call it Buddy. There was a pretty intense discussion about how it was not cool that they had taken this octopus from the wild to put into their aquarium. And I thought this was interesting. I think, as you'll see, the first comment makes reference to the Netflix documentary, My Octopus Teacher, which did really well. Many people saw it, I saw it, and it definitely creates a lot of empathy for that individual octopus that's in that movie. And so I think that there may be an octopus teacher effect here that we're seeing. There was even somebody wrote an actual letter to the editor on this topic. And if you look at the letter, what I think is interesting is that the writer starts by complimenting the Point Defiance Zoo for taking in 2 malnourished and miserable polar bears from a circus. For them, that was a great thing that the zoo did, creating that good home for them, getting them out of that bad situation. But that's really like a refuge kind of, or a sanctuary kind of move. But that worked for them. But then taking the octopus from the wild ocean didn't seem okay. So what I'm really seeing here is a possible transformation for zoos and aquaria, which is moving away from wild capture and moving away from breeding programs that are breeding solely for display. And then emphasizing conservation breeding programs that have a realistic chance of actually putting those individuals or their descendants back out into the wild, and also acting as a sanctuary/refuge. Now, what's interesting is that when I toured the aquarium today, I kept asking, well, where did this animal come from? Where did this one come from? And a huge number of the animals that are here are already rescues, or they were intercepted at the airport, or they had come here through some other complicated story. And this place is really acting as a sanctuary. Plus, there are a ton of cool conservation breeding programs going on right here. I got to see the white abalone program. I got to see the yellow-legged frogs that were rescued in the nick of time right before a huge wildfire came through and would have destroyed them. And I got to see the sort of exciting beginnings of the sea otter breeding program, which I think is a fabulous story. But all of those things are off display. Now, part of that is because they can't do anything that would endanger those animals when they're so precious as part of a conservation program. And so there's some logistical and regulatory challenges there. But honestly, I can see a place like this pivoting away from the wild capture and the breeding with very little outward changes to the visitor experience. I think that by focusing on conservation breeding in real legitimate conservation breeding programs and sanctuaries, plus with all the cool new tools that you can use in digital and other interactives, zoos and aquariums can continue to be places that the whole community wants to go to without having to breed just for captivity or do wild capture. I went to the SeaWorld website recently, I was actually, the reason I went there was to see how they were responding to the sudden death of the youngest orca whale that's still in captivity, which was recently. But this was at the top of their website. SeaWorld is committed to animal care rescue, rehabilitation, and return. So somebody is thinking along the same lines as I am over in their marketing department, at least, if not in their whole strategic planning department. When you go to buy your tickets, you get this message that says it's your chance to feel connected to the ocean. Okay, that's standard messaging there. And it says it will help fund wildlife rescue and rehabilitation. So there's definitely a pivot there towards this kind of rescue sanctuary model. And I think that's really interesting. I think that's where the public wants these institutions to go. This article just came out just a few days ago in Crosscut up in Seattle about how the Woodland Park Zoo and other Puget Sound area zoos are moving towards this empathy model. And so they are talking about how their animals make choices and how, they're setting up their kind of display programs so that the animals can show when they don't want to participate in performances. And there's a quote from a curator there about how kids seem to really understand when we ask them, hey, how many of you guys like it when your parents force you to do something you don't want to do? And I just think that if they keep going down this route, someone is going to ask the question, well, what if these animals don't want to be there at all? Then, what kind of choice can they make then? This was a comment that somebody left at the New York Times on my piece about zoos. And I think this person, E from Glen Ellen, Illinois, really hits the nail on the head here. The empathy that zoos hope to engender in visitors is precisely the reason I no longer go to zoos. So the zoos and aquariums have done such a good job that they are essentially changing the rules of the game for themselves. If you read the book, you can find out all the more detail behind how I come down on all of these rankings. But I think that what's really tricky and going to continue to be tricky as we try to balance our ethics about wild animals is that there are a lot of things that are valuable in the non-human world. I don't think nativeness and naturalness are valuable. But I do think that the flourishing of individuals and biodiversity is both valuable. And I think sometimes there are unavoidable trade-offs between those two very different, very valuable things. And working your way through those is never going to be something that you can, run it through an algorithm grinder and come out with the ethically right decision at the other end. At some level, some of these things are irreconcilable, and we just have to make choices. I mean, one thing that I think differentiates zoos from aquaria is that zoos have terrestrial animals, and if there was one animal you really wanted to see with all of your passion, you could organize your life, save up your money, go and see it. But aquarium try to bring us to a place that you really can't go, which is underwater. So I think that there is a difference there. I think the argument that they serve as a way to connect humans to a non-human world is possibly stronger for aquaria than it is for zoos because you can't get past that skin of the ocean so easily. But on the other hand, I think that there are ways that aquaria could do this without breeding or without wild capture. And I think that the obvious and deeply felt passion that everyone who works at aquaria has for all of these ocean creatures is going to ultimately be a pretty good guide as we try to figure out how to make these institutions still wonderful, beautiful places that can teach the next generation good ethics in the future. So thanks so much.
There'll be time for questions from the audience, but I want to ask two, just because.
Okay, is he coming through on that mic? You got to, for the folks at home, you got to speak into the mic.
First one is, the mouse story is interesting, and I'll just put a different twist on it that I thought about. Those mice were themselves amazing creatures.
Yes.
Because they were house mice that grew to like twice the size. It was a new species.
Yes.
So there is a part of conservationists would say, my God, those mice that were tiny little house mice are now twice as big teeth, killing animals. They're amazing creatures. So you could say, wow, isn't this an incredible, unique example of evolution? Maybe we shouldn't exterminate it.
Yeah.
And people, biologists like me who think about the amazing things evolution could do, kind of marveled at the mouse. But on your empathy thing, and you had it as a last point on your last slide, I think it's not just empathy. There you have it, human compassion and humility. I just think we were talking earlier today, and you know how everybody when they go to zoos at Aquaria, they often tap on the glass or they want to get the animal's attention, and they want to look at it. That's sort of like connecting. It's not just empathy. This is a value. It has nothing to do with conservation, nothing really to do with how we feel to the animals. It just makes us a little more humble about ourselves. So it could just make us better people even for interacting with other people, because we become less self-absorbed just by seeing. So that's slightly different than it's teaching us empathy and a connection to nature. It's teaching us that we're not the only thing in the universe, and we shouldn't be so smug and happy with ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the more we can, enact humility when we're trying to work our way through these difficult ethical conundrums, kind of erring on the side of humility is often, I think, a wise course. And so I think that one argument against, for example, having bigger or more difficult, more social animals in captivity is that it teaches young people that it's okay to do that, to kind of decide somebody else's life for it. So I think that could be tricky. But on the other hand, many of us do remember quite fondly a moment when we felt like we made a connection with a non-human. And it's easier to do that more reliably in an institution where there's a lot of non-human animals ready, right there, than it is walking through the woods. Although I say in my book that, you often, if you think back on your own life and your own memories of your own interactions with animals, often the ones that stick out the most are ones that were fortuitous, that you saw an animal from a car as you were driving, or you came around a bend, and maybe it wasn't even that sexy of an animal. Maybe it was just a deer or, something like that. But you have a moment where you didn't expect to see each other and you see each other. It's somehow way more magical than when you just pay your ticket and you're going to see. Like, I have this memory of this badger running across the road when I was driving east of Klamath Falls, that it just it felt like a star had fallen from the sky. It was just this magical thing of seeing this huge badger run across the road. But I could go see a badger any day of the week if I go to the right zoo.
Right. Surprise.
Yeah.
Surprise.
And that's actually one thing that I think is interesting, is that the orca program at SeaWorld is called Orca Encounter. And I really think the word encounter there is wrong, because an encounter is when you accidentally run into someone. You're like, oh, I encountered a such a thing. But when you pay for the orca encounter, it's more like an orca appointment.
Right. Questions?
Thank you. Ms. Harris, I noticed you didn't mention wild animal parks.
Oh, like big sort of safari park type
how do you
things?
feel about them? Pro, against? Is it just as bad? Is it a little better? Like, there's one in Malibu, I noticed it's called a wine Malibu thing.
Oh,
And
wow.
the owner has wild animals everywhere, giraffes and whatnot, and you pay, and you're on like this thing, but I didn't like it. I
Yeah.
didn't like it. And I know for a fact that some do get injured by misguided visitors. Some of the animals get hit and just et cetera, et cetera. But so what are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question, and I feel like there are a lot of gray areas here. I mean, for example, remember when the show Tiger King came out, and everybody was very quick to say, well, zoos are different than this, But sometimes zoos trade animals with some of these operations. There's a certain amount of back and forth. And then these wild parks, right? Northwest Trek is another one up in my neck of the woods. They seem like because the enclosures are larger and because the animals are kind of mixed up in these multi-species groups, they feel a little bit more natural, and maybe they're nicer for the animals who live there. But then what's weird too is then you think about something like Yellowstone National Park, which we think of as this super wild place, but they round up all of those bison every year and they cull them to a predetermined age and sex, formula. And they use helicopters to round them up, and they are very carefully managing all the animal populations of the wild animals in Yellowstone. So how are they different than one of these wild animal parks? There's some level in which they're somewhat similar. I would argue that the sea lions in the bay and the pigeons in downtown Long Beach are wilder than the wolves and the bison of Yellowstone, because nobody's managing them.
I have a question. Thank you for coming. It was really interesting. done so much research on the relationship between animals and humans. Is there a case or a situation to allow animals to become extinct?
That's a great question. So there is one test case that I find so interesting, which is the case of the mosquito. So the mosquito is the most dangerous wild animal on Earth because of malaria and other diseases that it can transmit. And so there's been a kind of a discussion, if we could, would we completely drive extinct, maybe not all mosquitoes, because there's so many different mosquito species, but maybe Aedes aegypti, the ones that are the vectors for the worst diseases. And I was listening to, very calmly doing the dishes and listening to the radio one day, and E.O. Wilson, the famous biodiversity proponent, was on the radio, and they asked him, what do you think about driving mosquitoes extinct? And he was like, oh, I'm all for it. And I was floored. I think I probably broke a dish. I was just totally stunned, because this is Mr. Biodiversity. But if E.O. Wilson is supporting driving Aedes aegypti extinct, then I'm willing to consider it. I think if you're Peter Singer, if you're a utilitarian, and you think about all of the suffering and death that those insects cause, with the still unknown level of sentience that an insect has, it seems like kind of the way to go would be to make them go extinct. There's another level at which it makes me uncomfortable as somebody who's been worshiping biodiversity for so many decades. So I don't know if there's a right answer for that one.
I had a question about, so in your book you mentioned, so it was very brief, you talked about just the fact that the vaquita porpoise is dwindling, and we don't even know really how many there are left, if any. And so here at the aquarium, that specific animal is an animal that we helped, for lack of better words, market the fact that their species was dwindling, and even sent, was it 1 million? We sent hundreds of thousands of postcards to the Mexican government to ask for the totoaba to stop being fished for their reasons, in hopes of the vaquita to not be in bycatch. So what are your thoughts on institutions going out of their way above and beyond for those types of animals? Because, I mean, we did that here for years, where we talked about the vaquita porpoise during all of our marine mammal feeds. Anytime we had an opportunity, because they are marine mammals, to just talk and have those conversations with people. And I think that hit home. We didn't save the species, but we opened up the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I was running the aquarium, I would tend to think that the way to go would be to put more of our resources and energy into these conservation programs, like the stuff that you're already doing with the frogs, the abalone, the otters, but then make that more part of the central part of the visitor experience. So rather than showing, here's species A that we bought from a different aquarium, or that we bred, or that we caught from the wild, and I'm going to tell you now about the sad plight of species B that lives far, far away, I would try to kind of merge that. I would try to sort of bring people in for a fun day with the kids, but also show them species B that is in peril, that we are breeding and that we're helping to save, and it's right here and you can look at it. So kind of merging that instead of, I think that there's a slightly uneasy marriage of entertainment and in education in an institution like this one. And I think that the fact that some of the animals are just there for entertainment is sometimes glossed over. But I don't know. I think it's good to have that conservation message. I'm also, I do a lot of thinking about how to deliver a conservation message in a way that doesn't bum people out and turn them off really quickly. I think it's a really tricky one, because we've heard so much about climate change and extinction and the sixth mass extinction and I mean, it makes people kind of shut down. And especially in an institution with so many children as the audience, I tend to think that focusing on the cool stuff and the wonder and the falling in love with the non-human world should be the emphasis, and there should be a much smaller dose of the sad stuff. I think there's other places where people can get the sad stuff. But I think it could be here, it could be there sprinkled in, but I don't know. The vaquita, it's like you don't have it here, so it seems a little removed from your... I hope that was a little bit of a rambling answer. I apologize.
Hi, Dr. Marris. I saw a documentary on dogs of Chernobyl, And there was, humans evacuated that within days. And interestingly, it seems that the animals and the foliage and trees and all that are doing well. What do you think the kind of behavior is going on with animals without humans being there? Because they just evacuated abruptly. I'm sure a lot of the animals passed, but I guess they're coming back in from outside. But with the fallout, I'm like, how are they even surviving? But
Right.
more so, what kind of behavior is happening with these animals with no humans around? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, to think about the way that humans have changed animal behavior. I think we underestimate the extent to which we change animal behavior, frankly. I mean, there are lots of species that we think of as nocturnal that are really only nocturnal because they live close by humans and we're active during the day, so that they have now gone to being active at night to basically avoid us. There are other species that make use of human roads and human kind of alterations to the landscape as part of their hunting strategy. Wolves in Alberta run along the lines that they've cut for oil and gas exploration and use those as hunting grounds. And I've got some fun examples in the book of birds in cities learning how to operate automatic doors so they can go in and out. And certainly animals have changed the pitch of their calls to deal with noise pollution. So I think animals have adapted to us in many, many ways. And of course, anytime you see an animal adapting in terms of moving because of climate change or changing behavior because of climate change, and probably the weirdest, experience that you can have is to go to a place like the Galapagos or to a place like Cochacashu, which is a research station in the Peruvian Amazon, where no animals have been killed for many monkey generations, and see how the animals act when they're not afraid of being killed by humans. And it's just wild. They just walk right up to you. They crawl into your suitcase and fall asleep. They try to climb on you. It makes one kind of yearn for some sort of world in which animals weren't afraid of humans. But then the irony is that when we do things like reintroduction, like with the otters, we have to hide ourselves so that the animals won't become habituated to humans. Because when animals are too friendly with humans, it can often lead to really tragic situations. So there's this real push-pull where I yearn for these kind of free and easy relationships with non-humans where we can kind of be buddies. But at the same time, I know that in the real world, those kind of relationships almost always end in, with a bullet. So it's a fascinating world to explore. And I like to think that maybe we'll figure out a way in a few more human generations to have more of those friendly relationships with other species where we can actually be in each other's lives in a free and easy way without us having to haze away animals that come too close.
Time for one more question. You want to?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation this evening. I was really drawn to the word soul in the capture. So I was wondering, when you came up with the title of your book, was it a process that you knew exactly what you wanted to write at the beginning, or in the course of writing it, came up with the title, or toward the end came up with the title? And I want to look at the idea of animals and souls and spirit, because I think people talk about their dogs and how close they are. And if we can look at an animal beyond that, that's simply an animal, help us, please, I'm asking, for us, which way do we need to look a little further as to the spirit of that animal or the soul of the animal, and then maybe mankind can change some of the things and move forward in the direction that every level is going to be looked at and protected.
Yeah, thanks for that question. The title, I'm not a religious person. So when I say soul, I don't mean it in some sort of metaphysical, spiritual sense necessarily, but I was thinking more along the lines of the way that people used to use the word souls in sort of more archaic English, like, oh, a ship sank and all souls aboard perished, or there was not a soul around that night. For me, it emphasizes the individuality of the animals, that they are individual selves as well as being units of a population. I have spent most of my career writing about conservation, in which you really do think of individuals as nodes in a network, individuals in a population. Like, for example, when Cecil the tiger was killed, do you guys remember that? Everybody was very upset. Beautiful, tiger, it was a lion. Beautiful lion, gorgeous shot, tragedy. But conservationists that I knew were like, I don't get why everyone's so pissed off. He was done breeding. So for them, as soon as he was done contributing reproductively, he was essentially dead to them anyway. So they no longer were worried about Cecil the lion. So the word souls there was meant to emphasize that these animals aren't just nodes in a population or item, part of a population. They also are individuals with their own selves. So I guess that's it. I guess we're going to adjourn for cocktails and conversation. Oh, the raffle.
Prizes to give out. You get to pick one.
I get to pick one. This is so exciting.
Just pull in a raffle ticket out, and you'll get her book that she'll give to you, and put her back.
Somebody will give it to you. Okay. You got to mix them up so there isn't whoever can will lead it. All right. And it's Diane Jensen.
And in an entirely appropriate move, I get a different raffle ticket. This is for a free drink.
Ah, okay. So tell the people who gets the free drink.
Its last name it's Daniel Eros, or is it Cross?
Daniel Eros? Cross? Gross. Daniel Gross.
Okay. So
If Daniel Gross isn't here, but you know Daniel Gross, then you get a free drink.
And so now we can go outside and have conversation. You do, Emma?
And I'll be signing some books, and feel free to ask me any questions, and I'll see you out there.
All right.